"Get your hands off my dress. You filthy, worthless woman. You have ruined the one day I will never get back." The sound of the slap cracked across the ballroom like a gunshot. Vanessa, the bride, screamed the words with her whole chest, and 200 guests in tuxedos and diamond earrings went absolutely silent. Dolores Freeman stood there with her cheek already reddening, her small clutch purse still hanging from her wrist, and not one person moved to help her. Not the waiters, not the string quartet frozen mid-note, not even her own son, standing 40 feet away with a champagne glass melting in his hand. Dolores turned. She smoothed the front of her thrift store dress with both palms, the way she'd done every Sunday morning of her life before walking into church. And she walked out of the Ashcombe Grand Hotel with her spine straight and her chin level. She did not cry. She did not look back. But 3 minutes later, when the first pair of headlights swept around the circular drive, Vanessa Whitfield would understand, in the space of about 4 seconds, that she had just put her hand across the face of the one person in that building with the power to end her entire family. Rewind 6 hours. The Ashcombe Grand smelled like white lilies and old money. If old money had a smell, which it does, cold marble, imported cedar polish, and the particular ozone tang of a chandelier budget that could feed a small town for a year, had. 1,200 crystal teardrops hung from the ceiling of the Magnolia Ballroom, each one catching the gold light and scattering it across linen tablecloths that cost $412 apiece to rent for one night. Dolores had read that number off a stray invoice, left on a catering cart, and she'd folded the thought away quietly, the way she folded away most things. She was 61 years old. Her hands were rough at the knuckles from 31 years of work. First, as a hospital ward clerk in Selby County, Georgia. Then nights spent doing other people's books at a kitchen table lit by a 40-watt bulb because the overhead light had burned out in 2009, and she'd never gotten around to replacing it. She wore small gold hoop earrings that had belonged to her mother, and a navy dress she had steamed in the bathroom of a Motel 6 that morning. Because she couldn't afford the $90 pressing fee, the hotel valet quoted her. She had come for one reason only. Her son, Terrence Freeman, was getting married. Terrence was 32, 6'2", with his mother's steady brown eyes and his late father's crooked, easy smile. He'd spotted her the second she walked through the gilded doors of the Ashcombe Grand, and his whole face had opened up like it always did. That same unguarded look he used to give her at 8 years old when thunder rattled the windows, and he'd crawl into her bed and insist he wasn't scared. He was just checking on her. A hostess in a starched black blazer intercepted Dolores before she'd taken 10 steps, glanced at a laminated seating chart, and pointed her toward a table pressed against the far wall, half swallowed by a floral arrangement the size of a small car. It was table 19. There were 18 tables between it and the head of the room. Dolores said, "Thank you." She always said, "Thank you." She had learned decades ago that the world handed you smaller and smaller rooms the older you got and the less money you visibly carried. And the only real defense was to walk into every room like you already owned the whole building. She had no idea, at that moment, that she actually did. Watch her hands for the next few hours. She keeps her wedding ring, Walter's ring, 26 years gone now, turned inward on her finger, the band worn thin and soft from being touched. That ring will matter later. Remember it. The bride's family, the Whitfields, occupied the front 3 tables like they'd been carved into the seating chart with a chisel. Foster Whitfield had built a real estate empire out of strip malls and parking garages across 3 states, the kind of fortune made mostly of lawsuits and leverage. His wife, Genevieve, wore a champagne-colored gown flown in from a designer in Milan and a smile that never once reached her eyes for the entire evening. Their daughter, Vanessa, had grown up inside that smile, learning early that people were sorted. The way real estate was sorted, by zip code, by square footage, by the names stitched into the label. Vanessa had never approved of Terrence's mother. Not once. Not from the first stiff dinner 18 months ago, where Vanessa had introduced Dolores to her parents with the enthusiasm of someone reading out a parking ticket. Dolores hadn't been welcomed into that family. She'd been tolerated, and there is a canyon of difference between the two, and Dolores had lived on the wrong side of that canyon her entire adult life without complaint. At table 19, two women glanced at Dolores's navy dress, then at each other, and did that small, private smirk people think is invisible. It is never invisible. A man in a charcoal suit walked past her without a nod, though she'd smiled first. These were small cuts. She had a lifetime of practice absorbing small cuts without bleeding where anyone could see. She thought about Walter. He'd died of a heart attack on a Thursday morning in March, when Terrence was 9 years old, and the whole architecture of her life had collapsed in the space of one phone call. She had been 34. She'd had a 9-year-old son, a mortgage in a modest Selby County neighborhood, and $1,100 in a savings account. She took a second job cleaning offices at night, then a third, doing bookkeeping on weekends for a diner 3 miles from her house. She turned down a marriage proposal from a good, patient man named Otis when Terrence was 15. Not because Otis wasn't worth loving, he was, but because she looked at her son and understood he needed the full, undivided weight of her attention, and she wasn't willing to split it, not even for kindness. Otis married someone else 2 years later and still sent her a Christmas every December. She kept every one of them in a shoebox on her closet shelf, and for 4 years she had kept a secret. Not a scandal, not a crime, just a choice she'd made at 29 years old, walking away from her family's business with the absolute certainty of someone young enough to trust her own conviction completely. Her maiden name was Ashworth. Her grandfather, a man named Cornelius Ashworth, had started a single truck freight company in 1961 with nothing but a diesel engine and a refusal to accept that a black man's business couldn't outlast every roadblock the world threw at it. By the time Dolores was born, Ashworth Freight and Logistics moved cargo through 4 states and employed 600 people. She had walked away from all of it at 29 to marry a mechanic named Walter Freeman, her family considered beneath her, changed her phone number, and built a life entirely on her own terms. She had told Walter the full truth 2 years into their marriage. He'd listened, quiet, and said only, "A person gets to choose what her life like, Dee. You chose. That's yours to keep." She'd loved him more for that sentence than for almost anything else he ever said to her. Her older brother, Marcus Ashworth, had run the company for 19 years after their father passed. 8 months ago, Marcus had died suddenly, without children, without a spouse, and the trust's governing documents were unambiguous about what came next. The firm's attorneys had been trying to reach Dolores for months through every formal channel they had. That morning, in the back of a hired car on her way to her son's wedding, she'd taken a brief, careful call from a number she recognized and said only, "Yes, I understand. I'll be in touch next week," before tucking the phone back into her purse and watching the city slide past the window. Vanessa had noticed that call. She'd walked past Dolores in the pre-ceremony hallway and caught a fragment of it. The low, deliberate tone, the way the older woman's spine had straightened almost imperceptibly. She filed it away with the mild curiosity of someone who expects, eventually, to discover it means nothing at all. She was about to discover exactly how wrong that expectation was. But first, she had a wedding to ruin, and she didn't even know it yet. The ceremony itself was flawless in the particular way that expensive things directed by professionals are always flawless. Every camera angle blocked in advance, every vow half-written by a consultant and half-personalized for the social media caption. Terrence, cried a little when Vanessa came down the aisle. Dolores, from her seat near the back, watched her son's face and felt something move through her that went past happiness into something quieter and more permanent. The sensation of having done the one essential thing of her life correctly. She had raised that boy whole. Whatever happened after this, that would always remain true. Reception. Cocktail hour. Then dinner in the Magnolia Ballroom, and this is where the seating chart turned from an oversight into a message. Table 19 sat Dolores beside a hearing-impaired great-uncle, whose hearing aid wasn't working, and a colleague of Terrence's, who knew absolutely no one else in the room. She ate her salmon. She had written a toast on an index card in her purse and had it memorized cold. She would not be asked to deliver it. The toasts came and went. Foster Whitfield, the maid of honor, two of Terrence's old college friends, who told stories that made the whole room laugh. Terrence's name was called 4 separate times. Dolores's name was called 0 times. She watched her son laugh at stories about himself and felt one small, sharp pang, identified it immediately, and set it down. She hadn't needed a microphone to give everything. She had to that man. It was sitting right there in his face, in his laugh, in the way he carried his shoulders. That didn't need an announcement. But Vanessa had been watching Dolores all night, and Vanessa had been planning. Here is where you need to lean in, because the next 4 minutes are the reason you're still listening. Near the end of the dinner course, Dolores walked to the edge of the serving station to retrieve a napkin she'd left at the appetizer table earlier. Vanessa was holding court nearby with 4 of her closest friends, a full glass of Merlot in her hand. She turned as Dolores approached, and something crossed her face. The specific look of someone who has just decided the moment has finally arrived. Vanessa raised her glass with a slightly exaggerated flourish and, in a motion that could theoretically have been clumsy, tipped the entire glass down the front of her own ivory bodice. The red bloomed across white satin like a wound opening. For one suspended second, the whole cluster of people around her went dead silent. Then her face transformed. "You did that," she said, low at first, building. "You walked straight into me. You knocked my glass." Dolores hadn't touched her. There wasn't a single witness within 15 feet who hadn't seen there was no contact between them. There also wasn't a single witness who said so out loud. "I didn't touch you," Dolores said, steady. "I wasn't anywhere near you. You were standing right there," Vanessa said, louder now, turning her body so her voice would carry to the surrounding tables. "You ruined my dress. You ruined my wedding dress." Her voice cracked on the last word with a precision that was, honestly, impressive. Heads turned across the ballroom. Chairs scraped back. The scattered crowd began condensing toward them, the way iron filings pull toward a magnet. Across the room near the bar, Terrence looked up and went still. Dolores tried again, quiet and level. "Vanessa, I'm sorry about your dress. But I did not touch you." "Don't apologize for something you didn't do," Vanessa snapped, cutting her off entirely. "Just stand there and tell me, to my face, that you belong here. At my wedding. At my table in this room." The words had stopped being about the dress about 90 seconds earlier, and every person in earshot understood it perfectly. Nobody moved. That specific human paralysis had settled over the crowd, the one that shows up whenever something ugly starts happening, inside something beautiful. "You don't belong here," Vanessa said, and her voice climbed into a register that sliced clean through the string quartet and reached every corner of the Magnolia Ballroom. "You have never belonged here. You have never belonged anywhere near my husband, and you sure as hell don't belong at my wedding." What happened in the next 3 seconds was witnessed by roughly 180 of the 200 guests in that room, and every single one of them would describe it years later with a strange, crystalline clarity usually reserved for things that last far longer than 3 seconds. Vanessa Whitfield drew back her hand and slapped Dolores Freeman across the face. The sound of it, sharp, absolute, final, rang out into a silence so complete you could hear the ice settling in someone's drink 4 tables away. Dolores's head turned with the force of it. Her hand rose slowly to her cheek. The water glass she'd been holding slipped from her other hand and shattered against the marble. "Get out," Vanessa said. Cold now, strange, almost quiet. "You don't belong here." The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was the silence of complicity, 200 people each quietly calculating whether saying something would cost them anything. Terence stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, his face gone, the particular gray of a man watching something his body understands before his mind catches up. He was 32 years old, and his mother was standing in the center of a ballroom, with her hand pressed to her cheek. And he had not moved. He had not moved. Dolores's eyes found his across the room. She held his gaze for one long moment. Then she looked away. She bent, picked up the largest shard of broken glass, set it on a passing tray, straightened her spine, smoothed the front of her dress, and walked toward the exit. She walked the way she'd learned to walk through every hard room of her life, not fast, not slow, head level, no performance of pain, and no performance of pride either. The crowd parted for her without anyone visibly deciding to part. She crossed the marble lobby, passed through the revolving doors, and stepped out into the cool night air of the circular drive. And there, alone, under the porte-cochere lights, she let out one slow breath and finally allowed herself to feel the sting spreading across her cheek. Remember that ring turned inward on her finger. She touched it once, the way she always did when she needed Walter close. Then she reached into her purse for her phone. That's when the first set of headlights came around the corner. You need to hear this part exactly as it happened, because most people don't believe it the first time either. 3 black Rolls-Royce Phantoms turned off Delacroix Avenue and rolled into the circular drive of the Ashcombe Grand with the kind of silence only very expensive machinery can produce. They came to rest in a neat row before the entrance, and the effect against the valet stand, the topiary hedges, and the small cluster of guests who'd stepped outside for air was immediate and impossible to ignore. 4 men climbed out of the lead car first, dressed plainly, but standing with the particular stillness of men trained for exactly this kind of moment. They fanned out. 1 toward the drive's entrance, 1 near the lobby doors, 2 flanking the spot where Dolores stood, still holding her phone, watching the whole scene with the expression of someone expecting a minor inconvenience and getting something else entirely. From the second car stepped a man in his 60s, silver at the temples, wearing a charcoal suit tailored to a precision that was obvious even from 30 feet away. He crossed the drive at something just short of a jog, stopped in front of Dolores, and did something the hotel staff watching through the lobby windows would talk about for months afterward. He bowed his head, not a nod. A real bow, brief, unmistakable, the kind given only by people who don't give it easily. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice carried clean across the still night air. "My name is Preston Calloway. I am senior counsel for the Ashworth Family Trust. We have been trying to reach you through proper channels for 8 months. I apologize for the manner of tonight's arrival, but the Trust's affairs have reached a point requiring your direct and immediate attention." He paused, and his eyes moved briefly to the red mark blooming on her cheek. "We became aware of a situation inside. We felt it was important, you know, before you left, that you would not be leaving alone." Behind them, guests had begun spilling out through the lobby doors to see what 3 Rolls-Royces were doing at a wedding. Among them stood Vanessa, still in her wine-ruined dress, still gripping an empty champagne flute like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Beside her, Terence's face was working through something enormous, too many realizations arriving at once, and no idea which one to grab first. "How did you know I was here?" Dolores asked quietly. "The Trust has maintained general awareness of your location for a number of years," Calloway said. "Careful, honest. We've never intruded. Tonight, the circumstances seemed to warrant an exception. I'm fine, she said in the exact tone she'd used to say those two words for 24 straight years. I'd like to go home. Of course, he said. Whenever you're ready. She was ready. But Terence was already crossing the drive toward her, and she waited, because she was his mother, and she had never once in her life walked away from him when he needed her standing still. Here is the part where everything Terence thought he knew gets rewritten in real time. So pay attention. The Ashworth Family Trust was not a modest thing. It was one of the largest privately held freight and logistics operations in the Southeast, with warehousing and port contracts stretching from the Georgia coastline into 3 neighboring states. Terence knew none of this. He knew his mother had grown up outside Selby County and worked hard for everything she'd ever owned. He knew, in the vague way adult children accept the stories they've been handed without ever pulling the thread, what his mother's family had once been comfortable, and that she'd chosen to build her own path instead. He pressed now, standing on the cobblestone drive with his wedding reception, still audible through the hotel walls behind him. Mom, he said, who are these people? They manage the company, she said. My family's company. Your great-grandfather started it. I left when I was young. I've been separate from it a long time, but it's still mine. She paused. I always meant to tell you. I was waiting for the right time. How big? He asked, finally. She told him a range, not an exact figure, because she genuinely wasn't certain of the current one, but a range large enough to retroactively rewrite the meaning of every folding chair she'd ever sat in, every dress she'd ever worn to save money, every table near a back wall she'd ever been quietly assigned. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, You were sitting at that table in the back. All night. Yes, she said. All night. Yes. He put his hand over his mouth and didn't speak for a while. Then he turned and looked at the small crowd gathered in the hotel doorway, and among them, Vanessa, standing very still now, holding her flute in both hands like something she was afraid would shatter if she let go. Word had already traveled through the ballroom, the way only real gossip can. 3 Rolls-Royces, men in dark suits, Ashworth Family Trust, billions. And the temperature in that room changed the way weather changes. Not all at once, but perceptibly, pressure dropping, light shifting somehow. People who'd watched Vanessa slap Dolores and said absolutely nothing now wore expressions of very studied concern. Foster Whitfield stood near a window, speaking urgently into his phone. Doing the math a man does when he suddenly understands, he may have just lit a fire under his own house. Vanessa followed Terence outside. The night air against her ruined dress was cold, and she felt something she wasn't used to feeling, the specific vertigo of discovering your entire read on a situation was not just wrong, but catastrophically, publicly wrong. She'd spent 2 years believing she understood the terms of this marriage. She was marrying down, doing Terence something of a favor, and his mother was a liability to be quietly managed. She had never once considered that she might be the smallest person in the equation. She put her flute down on a stone ledge and walked toward Terence, careful in her heels on the cobblestones. Terence, she started, her voice different now, softer, unpracticed. I need you not to talk right now, he said, and it wasn't loud, but it didn't invite a second attempt. He turned back to his mother. What passed between them didn't need many words. The old, worn language of a mother and son who'd survived hard things together and learned to talk in the register just underneath speech. He asked if she was hurt. She said she was fine. He looked at the mark on her cheek and said nothing else. She touched his face once. He covered her hand with his own. Then he turned and walked back toward Vanessa, and something in the way he moved had changed, settled, arrived somewhere. He stopped in front of her. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I don't know what came over me. It was the stress of the whole day. When did you find out she might be connected to money? He asked. I didn't. Because I'm asking, he said, whether you're sorry for who she is as a person, or whether you're sorry she turned out richer than you thought. The question landed in that courtyard and didn't go anywhere. Nobody moved. Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed, and what came out after a long, ugly pause was nothing at all. Dolores watched that silence and understood it completely, the way she understood most things, without the mercy of ambiguity. She walked toward Vanessa, not quickly, the same unhurried walk she'd used, leaving the ballroom. Vanessa, she said, and her voice wasn't cruel. I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think before you answer. If I'd walked out of this hotel tonight exactly the way I walked in my Motel 6 dress, with my mother's gold earrings, with nothing behind me but the work I've done and the son I raised, would you be standing here apologizing to me right now? The courtyard went completely quiet. Somewhere on Delacroix Avenue, a single car passed. Inside, the music had stopped entirely. Vanessa didn't answer. She didn't answer because, for the first time perhaps in her adult life, she was being fully, brutally honest with herself. And the honest version of Vanessa Whitfield did not have an answer that was both true and survivable to say out loud. Dolores nodded. That's what I thought, she said, not unkindly. Thank you for being honest. She turned to her son. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized straight from his childhood. The look he got when he'd done something wrong and was waiting, wide open, for her verdict. Mom, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I'm sorry. I should have protected you, she said. She looked at him a long moment. Yes, she said simply. You should have. She let that sit exactly as long as it needed to sit. But you're holding it now, she said. That matters. He crossed the last few feet and she held him, this 32-year-old man who still had his father's laugh, and the courtyard around them stayed still and quiet, and a few of the gathered witnesses looked away out of something like shame, and a few did not. He stepped back, still holding her hands, and turned to look at the lit lobby doors, the ballroom beyond them, the reception that had cost more money than he now understood in an entirely different way than he had an hour earlier. He looked at Vanessa. Her face, for once, was showing something that wasn't performance, real, unpracticed uncertainty. I'm not going back in there, he said, to no one in particular, and to everyone present. Vanessa made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Genevieve Whitfield, who'd come outside at some point during all this, said, Terence, the wedding is over. I know, he said even. It's the voice of a man who's made a decision that will cost him something and has already decided he'll pay it. I'm sorry to the guests. I'm sorry for what this means for everyone in that room. But what happened tonight? He stopped. What happened tonight isn't something I can walk back in and celebrate. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The reaction from the Whitfield side wasn't quiet or immediate. Foster talked about contracts. Genevieve wept, loudly, visibly. Guests drained out of the ballroom in twos and threes into the lobby and courtyard, murmuring in the low, urgent tones of people recalculating everything they thought they knew about the evening. Terence didn't go back inside. He sat with his mother in the courtyard, while Preston Calloway had the hotel kitchen bring out tea, and the reception dissolved behind them, and the two of them talked. They talked for a long time. He asked her about his grandfather, about the company, about why she'd left, about his father, about the years. He was small and she'd worked 3 jobs, and what had actually been happening underneath the version of it he'd seen as a child. She told him things she'd held in the closed fist of her private self for over 2 decades. Telling them felt strange and relieving. Like setting down a weight so old and so familiar you'd forgotten it had a weight at all. Near the end, she told him about a scholarship program she had run quietly, anonymously for 11 years, through a foundation whose name had never once been publicly connected to hers. 58 young people funded so far. 4 of them now in medical school. 2 had started their own businesses. He hadn't known any of it. His face did something he couldn't name, but she recognized it. The look of a man whose understanding of a person had just outgrown the frame he'd been keeping her in. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because I didn't want you to love me differently," she said. "I wanted you to love me the way you did when you were 9, when I was just your mother, and that was enough." "It was always enough," he said. "I know," she said, smiling now, "but it's nice to hear. Here's the part I want you to sit with, because this is where the real story is." The months after that night, at the Ashcombe Grand, moved with the strange double speed of time after something breaks. Slower and faster at once, full of reckonings that gradually settled into a new shape. The Ashworth Family Trust formally reinstated Dolores as principal heir and board chair, a process as managed with quiet precision by Preston Calloway over 11 weeks of documents and meetings. She found offices in a downtown building she'd driven past 1,000 times without ever knowing her family's name sat on the deed. She walked into a boardroom full of executives who'd been managing pieces of her inheritance for 2 decades, and they watched her with a complicated mix of relief and careful appraisal. She was not overwhelmed. She was 61 years old. She had run a household on nothing, worked 3 jobs at once, raised a son alone, and kept her own counsel for 24 years. A boardroom, it turned out, was just a bigger room. The skills were the same. She expanded the scholarship foundation under the trust's umbrella. New tracks in nursing, in skilled trades, in early childhood education, wherever the need was obvious and the funding had always been thin. She didn't hold a press conference about any of it. The work happened, the people it reached received it, and that, to her, was enough. Terence rebuilt his life carefully, the way you do when a large illusion has been removed, and you're not yet certain what's left standing underneath it. He went to work. He called his mother most days. He started, for the first time in years, actually examining the assumptions he'd been living inside, about Vanessa, about what he'd needed from that relationship, about what he'd been willing to overlook to keep a version of his future he'd decided in advance he wanted. It wasn't comfortable. He did it anyway. Now here's where Vanessa's part of the story goes. And I want you to really pay attention, because this is where the debt gets collected. The wedding's collapse didn't stay contained to one night. Word moves in circles like the Whitfields, and it moves fast. 3 separate members of the Ashcombe Grand's regular clientele. Women Vanessa had once treated to lunch and called friends, quietly stopped returning her calls within a month. A charity board she'd been angling to join for 2 years rescinded its informal invitation without much explanation, though everyone in that circle understood exactly why. Foster Whitfield's firm, which had been in the middle of negotiating a logistics contract with a mid-sized freight partner, discovered that partner had recently been acquired. Folded quietly into a larger holding company under the Ashworth name. The contract wasn't canceled out of spite. It simply wasn't renewed, the way business relationships sometimes just aren't, when the person on the other side of the table no longer sees a reason to extend goodwill she was never shown herself. Vanessa found herself 8 months later, sitting alone in an apartment she'd once shared with dreams of a very different life, replaying that one sentence in the courtyard over and over. "Would you be standing here apologizing to me right now?" She never did come up with an answer she could live with. That was, in its own quiet way, the whole punishment. Not a courtroom, not a headline, just a question she would carry the rest of her life and never be able to close. At an industry gathering the following spring, a regional logistics conference the Ashworth Trust had sponsored for 18 consecutive years. Going back to her father's stewardship of the company, Dolores stood at a podium in front of several hundred people. She wore a dress made for her by a seamstress in Selby County who'd been sewing for 40 years and whose work was extraordinary. She didn't use notes. I spent a long time, she said, living at a scale far smaller than my circumstances technically required. I did that by choice, and I don't regret one day of it, because the smallness I lived inside was rich in every way that actually matters, in love, in purpose, in knowing exactly what I was doing and exactly why I was doing it. But I want to say one thing plainly to everyone in this room. The world will tell you over and over in 100 different ways that you can measure a person's worth by what they visibly carry. It will tell you this with architecture, with seating charts, with the tone of voice people use toward someone who looks like they have less. And the world will be wrong every single time. The truest thing I know about human worth is this: it does not change based on what a person can offer you. It was exactly the same at the back of that ballroom as it is standing right here at this podium. The only thing that ever changes is whether the people in the room are willing to see it. She stepped back. The room was silent for a moment. Then it wasn't. On a clear, cool morning, 8 months after the wedding, 3 black Rolls-Royce Phantoms pulled up outside the glass and limestone headquarters of the Ashworth Family Trust on Delacroix Avenue. Dolores stepped out of the lead car, wearing a deep blue-green dress, her hair pinned up, her mother's gold hoops in place. The same ones she'd checked twice in a hotel mirror the morning of her son's wedding. She stood on the sidewalk a moment and looked up at her family's name cut into the steel above the entrance. She had driven past this building for years without knowing it was hers. She knew now. She crossed the marble lobby. Staff nodded as she passed, the particular nod reserved for people. Everyone in the building understands exactly who they're looking at. She was not the woman who'd been slapped and told to leave a wedding. She was not the woman assigned to table 19, behind the flower arrangement the size of a car. She was all of those women, and more than any single one of them. And she carried every version of herself with her into the elevator, up to the floor where the boardroom waited, where the work waited, where the morning waited with everything it held. She had always been ready. The room, finally, was simply the right size. If this story got under your skin, not because of how it ended, but because you recognized somebody in it, hit like so, it reaches the person who actually needs to hear it today. Share it if you know someone who's been quietly folded into a back table their whole life and never once complained. And tell me in the comments honestly, have you ever stood in that room? And which side of it were you standing on? I read every single one.